They told everyone I died in a car accident in Paris 8 years ago, cremated overseas, no body to bring home, just an empty casket, and endless sympathy cards. Today, I walked into my mother's biggest gallery opening in Manhattan wearing the emerald necklace she thought burned with me in that fabricated crash, and when my stepfather saw me, his martini slipped from his trembling fingers. I'm Maya Blackwood, and this is how I came back from the dead to expose the family that tried to kill me. I never meant to survive that night in the Swiss Alps, when the brakes on my rental car mysteriously failed and I careened off the mountain road into the ravine below, but somehow I crawled out of that wreckage with nothing but a broken arm and the sudden clarity that my stepfather Richard Pemberton had just tried to murder me for my inheritance. The official report said Maya Blackwood, age 22, died on impact vehicle explosion. No remains recovered, and while my family mourned their tragic loss, I disappeared into the shadows of European hostels and minimum wage jobs, trying to stay alive long enough to prove the truth. The blood on my hands that night wasn't just from the broken windshield, it was from the realization that someone I'd called father for 7 years had just tried to end my life. I remember crawling through the twisted metal of what used to be a red BMW, the smell of gasoline and burning rubber filling my lungs as I pulled myself up the rocky slope and away from the wreckage. I should have died. The car should have exploded like it was designed to, but sometimes fate has other plans. I made it to a small village called Grindelwald before dawn. My arm was definitely broken, and my face was a mess of cuts and bruises, but I was alive. I told the local doctor I'd been hiking alone and fallen the language barrier. Help. Nobody asked too many questions. They patched me up, gave me pain medication, and set me on my way with a bill I paid in cash. I'd always carried cash when traveling, a habit my real father had taught me before he died when I was 15. That first night hiding in a youth hostel in Interlaken, I watched the Swiss news on a fuzzy television in the common room. There it was, my car, my supposed death, the dramatic helicopter footage of the rescue teams searching the ravine, finding nothing but twisted metal and assumptions. Maya Blackwood, daughter of prominent New York gallery owner Victoria Blackwood, presumed dead after tragic accident, the reporter spoke in clipped German. But I understood enough to know my obituary was already being written. I called my mother from a pay phone outside the hostel, my hands shaking as I dialed the number I'd known by heart since childhood. It rang 4 times before Richard answered, his voice smooth and concerned. Blackwood residence. It's me, I whispered into the receiver. Maya, I'm alive. Richard, the car accident I survived. The silence on the other end stretched so long, I thought the line had gone dead. Then I heard him take a breath, slow and controlled. Maya, that's impossible. You died in the crash. The authorities confirmed it. No, I said louder. Now I'm calling you from Switzerland. I'm hurt, but I'm alive. Where's my mother? There was another pause, then his voice changed, became colder, more calculated. I think you're mistaken. This is a very cruel prank call. Maya Blackwood died 3 days ago. We're planning her funeral. The line went dead. I stood there holding the receiver, listening to the dial tone as the truth crashed over me like a second car accident. Richard wasn't surprised that I was alive. He was disappointed, and in that moment I understood that my survival wasn't just lucky, it was dangerous to him, because dead daughters don't ask questions about trust funds or inheritance or why their stepfather needed them gone. I bought a burner phone that afternoon and called my mother's direct line at the gallery. It rang and rang until finally her assistant picked up. I'm sorry, Ms. Blackwood isn't taking calls right now. She's in mourning for her daughter.
This is her daughter, I said.
The assistant's voice turned cold. Sir, this is incredibly inappropriate. The Blackwood family is grieving. Please don't call again. She hung up, and I realized Richard had already started rewriting history. I was dead according to everyone who mattered, and any attempt to prove otherwise would be dismissed as delusion or cruel pranks. The man who had tried to kill me was now controlling the narrative of my death. That night, I made a decision. If Maya Blackwood was officially dead, then Maya Blackwood would stay dead until I could prove why someone wanted her that way. I cut my long dark hair short, dyed it blonde, and started calling myself Anna Williams. The first found work cleaning hotel rooms in Zurich, then later in Prague, always paying cash, always moving, always watching over my shoulder. For 8 years I lived as a ghost. I worked in restaurants, hotels, tourist shops, anywhere that paid cash, and didn't ask too many questions about work permits. I learned 5 languages, became an expert at disappearing into crowds, and most importantly, I learned how to investigate. I spent every spare moment and every spare franc tracking Richard Pemberton's movements, his finances, his associates, his secrets. The first breakthrough came 2 years after the accident. I was working at a cafe in Vienna when I overheard two men at a corner table speaking in German about automotive sabotage. One of them mentioned a job in Switzerland, a brake line failure that had been disguised as an accident. The other man, Klaus Brenner, laughed and said it was his easiest 20,000 euros ever. They never even found the body. I followed Klaus home that night and spent the next 3 months learning everything about him, where he lived, where he worked, who paid him. I broke into his apartment when he was away and found files, detailed records of every job he'd ever done, including photographs of my BMW taken before and after he'd tampered with the brakes. The before photos showed a perfectly functional car. The after photos showed exactly where he'd cut the brake lines and loosened the bolts that would fail under pressure. I copied everything, photographed every document, every receipt, every communication. Then I dug deeper into Klaus's financial records. I found the payment, 20,000 euros transferred from a Swiss bank account registered to a shell company called Alpine Holdings. I traced Alpine Holdings through 3 layers of corporate obfuscation until I found the real owner, Richard Pemberton. But evidence wasn't enough. I needed confessions, testimonies, witnesses, and most importantly, I needed to stay alive long enough to use them. Klaus Brenner had been hired to kill people before and after me. I wasn't his first job or his last, and men like Richard didn't stop at one failed attempt. They just got more careful the next time. I spent the next 3 years building an airtight case. I tracked down Klaus's other victims, found patterns in Richard's business dealings that showed a man willing to remove obstacles permanently. I discovered that my trust fund worth $12 million had been quietly absorbed into Richard's personal accounts after my death. The insurance payout of $5 million had gone directly to expanding the gallery Richard had used my murder to fund his empire. I also learned that I wasn't his first victim. Richard's first wife, Sarah, had died in a suspicious boating accident 6 months after she'd threatened to divorce him. Sarah's children from her first marriage had been systematically pushed out of the family business until they'd given up and moved away. Richard had a pattern of eliminating anyone who threatened his control of other people's money. The second breakthrough came when Klaus Brenner was arrested for insurance fraud in Germany. His confession to reduce his sentence included details about jobs he'd done all over Europe, including one in Switzerland where he'd sabotaged the brakes on a young woman's car for an American businessman who paid in cash. Klaus had kept records of everything, including audio recordings of his conversations with Richard. I contacted Klaus's lawyer through an intermediary and offered to provide additional evidence for Klaus's defense in exchange for copies of those recordings. The lawyer was skeptical until I provided him with financial documents that corroborated Klaus's story. Suddenly, Klaus's claims about the American businessman didn't seem so far-fetched. Listening to those recordings was like hearing my own death being planned. Richard's voice was calm, professional, as he described exactly how he wanted the accident to look. He specified that it should happen on a mountain road, that the car should go over a cliff, that there should be fire to eliminate DNA evidence. He even suggested Klaus wait for bad weather to make the crash seem more plausible. I listened to Richard plan my murder with the same tone he used to discuss catering for gallery openings. But the most damning recording came at the end. Klaus asked what would happen if the plan failed, if somehow I survived. Richard's response was chilling: "Then we'll try again until we get it right." That's when I knew I could never truly be safe until Richard was in prison. I could hide for the rest of my life, keep working minimum wage jobs, keep looking over my shoulder, keep being Anna Williams instead of Maya Blackwood, or I could come back from the dead and finish this permanently. The decision was made easier when I saw the invitation to my mother's latest gallery opening forwarded through a chain of contacts I'd maintained in New York. It was being billed as her greatest triumph, a retrospective of her work over the past decade, including a series called Grief Studies that she'd started after my supposed death. The irony was bitter. Richard was profiting from my mother's grief over my murder while spending the money he'd stolen from my inheritance. I flew back to New York on a passport I'd acquired through channels I'd rather not detail. Anna Williams died quietly in a Prague hotel room, and Maya Blackwood began the process of resurrection. I rented a small apartment in Queens under my real name, using identity documents I'd hidden before leaving for Switzerland 8 years earlier. I was legally dead, but legally dead people can sometimes be restored to life with the right paperwork and the right lawyers. I spent 2 weeks preparing, gathering evidence, rehearsing what I would say, and most importantly, deciding exactly how to reveal myself for maximum impact. I wanted Richard to confess publicly. I wanted witnesses. I wanted the whole art world of Manhattan to see exactly what kind of man they'd been celebrating. The Blackwood Gallery was buzzing with Manhattan's art elite the night I returned. Champagne glasses clinked against the backdrop of my mother's latest exhibition, abstract paintings that sold for more money than most people made in a year. I slipped through the crowd wearing a black dress I'd bought that morning, and the emerald necklace that was supposed to be my grandmother's final gift to me, the one Richard told everyone had been destroyed in the fire that supposedly consumed my body in that Swiss morgue. I'd recovered the necklace from a safe deposit box I'd rented before leaving for Europe 8 years earlier, along with other family heirlooms and documents I'd suspected Richard might try to steal after my death. Wearing it tonight wasn't just symbolic, it was evidence that Maya Blackwood had never really died. She'd just been waiting. I spotted my mother first, Victoria Blackwood, now Victoria Pemberton, standing beside a massive canvas that looked like someone had thrown paint at it in a fit of rage. She was older now, silver threading through her auburn hair, but still stunning in that effortless way that had made her the darling of New York society. Her laugh carried across the room, the same musical sound I remembered from childhood bedtime stories and Saturday morning pancakes before Richard changed everything. The painting she stood beside was titled Absence, and according to the placard it represented the void left by irretrievable loss. I wondered if my mother knew how literally true that was, or if she still believed her daughter was ashes scattered somewhere in the Swiss Alps. Richard stood beside her, his arm possessively around her waist, and I felt that familiar chill of recognition. He was still handsome in that calculated way, silver hair, perfectly styled, expensive suit that probably cost more than most people's cars, but I could see what others missed, the way his eyes constantly scanned the room like a predator assessing threats, the cold smile that never reached his eyes, the same smile he'd worn when he handed me those car keys in Switzerland. I moved closer, weaving through clusters of art collectors and socialites, until I was close enough to hear their conversation. Richard was discussing a piece called Rebirth, telling a potential buyer how it represented Victoria's journey through grief and loss, how art had saved her after losing her daughter in that terrible accident overseas. My jaw clenched as I listened to him monetize my supposed death, turning my mother's pain into a sales pitch. That's when I stepped forward close enough that the scent of my perfume, the same vanilla and jasmine I'd worn since high school, would reach them. Victoria turned first, her eyes scanning the crowd casually until they landed on me and froze. The color drained from her face so quickly I thought she might faint. Her hand flew to her throat, fingers searching for pearls that weren't there, a nervous habit I remembered from childhood. Maya, she whispered so quietly I almost didn't hear it over the cocktail party chatter, but Richard heard it. His head snapped toward me, and for a split second I saw something flicker in his eyes, not surprise, not joy, but something much darker, something like terror. His face went pale as marble, his martini glass slipped from his fingers and shattered against the polished concrete floor, sending olives rolling across the gallery. "Hello, Mother," I said, keeping my voice steady, calm. "I've missed your openings." Victoria's mouth opened and closed like she was trying to speak underwater. Her hand reached toward me, then stopped halfway between us, as if she wasn't sure I was real. Around us, conversations had stopped. People were staring, some probably recognizing my face from old family photos that still hung in Victoria's penthouse, others just sensing the tension that was crackling between us like electricity before a storm. Richard recovered faster than I expected. He stepped slightly in front of Victoria, his body language protective, but I knew better. I knew it was the same way a snake coils before it strikes. "This is impossible," he said, his voice controlled, but I caught the tremor underneath. "You died in Switzerland. We had a service. We have the death certificate." "Do you?" I asked, tilting my head slightly, because I never signed one. The gallery around us had gone completely quiet now. Even the background music seemed to have stopped. I could see people pulling out phones, discreetly recording what was clearly about to become the social event of the season. Some were already posting to Instagram stories that would be screenshot and shared across Manhattan society within minutes. Victoria finally found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Maya, how are you here? Where have you been all these years? Why didn't you call? Why didn't you come home?" "Because," I said, looking directly at Richard, "home wasn't safe for me, was it?" His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and I saw his hand move toward his jacket pocket. I'd learned to read body language during my years of hiding, and Richard was calculating something dangerous. "I don't know what you're implying," he said, "but this is neither the time nor the place for whatever delusion you're suffering from. You've clearly been through some kind of trauma. Maybe we should call someone, a doctor." The irony wasn't lost on me, Richard suggesting I needed medical attention when he was the one who'd tried to ensure I'd never need medical attention again. I reached into my purse slowly, deliberately, and pulled out a manila envelope thick with documents and photographs. Actually, I said, I think we should call someone, but not a doctor. I opened the envelope and pulled out the first photograph, a picture of Richard meeting with Klaus Brenner in a Zurich cafe 2 days before my accident. The timestamp was clearly visible, and I'd had the photo authenticated by 3 different forensic experts. Klaus, as I discovered through years of careful investigation, was a mechanic who specialized in making car accidents look accidental. He'd been arrested 6 months ago for insurance fraud and had made quite a detailed confession to reduce his sentence. Victoria's hand flew to her mouth as she stared at the photo. Richard, where were you the week Maya had her accident? You said you were in London on business. I was, Richard said quickly, but his voice had lost some of its smooth confidence. This is obviously doctored. Anyone can manipulate photos these days. I pulled out the second photograph, Richard handing Klaus an envelope thick with cash, and the third, Klaus working underneath a red rental car, the same make and model I'd been driving. The photos were taken by Klaus himself as insurance against future blackmail. I pulled out the bank records showing Richard's wire transfer to a Swiss account 2 days before my supposed death, and insurance documents showing he'd increased my life insurance policy to $5 million just 3 months earlier. But the real bombshell was the audio recording. I pulled a small speaker from my purse and pressed play. Klaus Brenner's voice filled the gallery, accented but clear, as he described the job he'd been hired to do. The American businessman wanted it to look like an accident, Klaus said in the recording. Brake lines cut loose bolts on the suspension so it would fail under pressure. He was very specific about the location, said it had to be a mountain road with a long drop, said there had to be fire to eliminate evidence. He paid me €20,000, half up front, half after confirmation of death. Then came Richard's voice, unmistakably, his giving Klaus detailed instructions about timing, about weather conditions, about exactly how he wanted my car to fail. And when the recording ended with Klaus asking what would happen if I somehow survived, Richard's response was chilling. Then we'll try again until we get it right. The gallery had gone completely silent. The only sound was the soft hum of the air conditioning and someone's sharp intake of breath. Victoria was staring at Richard like she'd never seen him before, tears streaming down her face. You tried to kill my daughter. Richard looked around the room, calculating his options. He could see the phones recording, could see the crowd of Manhattan's most powerful people, all watching, all listening, all ready to testify if necessary. His shoulders slumped slightly, and for the first time since I'd known him, he looked old. I tried to solve a problem permanently, he said, his voice oddly calm. Victoria should be thanking me. We used the insurance money to expand the gallery, to buy this building, to become what we are today. Your daughter was bleeding us dry with her trust fund and her expensive lifestyle and her complete inability to contribute anything meaningful to the family business. What we are, Victoria repeated, her voice hollow. What we are is built on my daughter's murder. Attempted murder, I corrected dryly, since clearly I'm still here. That's when Victoria did something that surprised everyone in the room, including me. She walked over to the gallery's landline phone and dialed 3 numbers, 911. Yes, I need the police, she said, her voice steady despite the tears. The Blackwood Gallery, 47th and Madison. My husband just confessed to attempted murder in front of 200 witnesses. Richard lunged for the phone, but several male guests stepped in front of him, holding him back. While we waited for the police to arrive, I continued laying out evidence for the growing crowd of witnesses. I showed them the forensic reports on Klaus's sabotage, the financial records showing how Richard had absorbed my trust fund, the timeline of events that proved premeditation. I also revealed something that made several people gasp in shock. This wasn't Richard's first attempt at murder. His first wife, Sarah, had died in a suspicious boating accident 6 months after threatening divorce, and her children had been systematically pushed out of the family business. Richard had a pattern of eliminating anyone who threatened his control of other people's money. When the police arrived 20 minutes later, they found a room full of Manhattan's elite, all eager to serve as witnesses to Richard Pemberton's confession. They found insurance fraud evidence that had already been forwarded to federal investigators, and they found a daughter who'd spent 8 years collecting evidence, building a case, and waiting for the perfect moment to return from the dead. As they led Richard away in handcuffs, he looked at me with pure hatred. You should have stayed dead, Maya. Maybe, I said, but then I would have missed seeing you in Orange. The aftermath was swift and brutal. Richard was charged with attempted murder, conspiracy, insurance fraud, and embezzlement. The evidence was overwhelming, and his confession in front of 200 witnesses made a trial almost unnecessary. He pleaded guilty to all charges and was sentenced to 25 years in prison without the possibility of parole. Victoria and I stood in the empty gallery after everyone had left, after the police had taken Richard away, after the reporters had finally stopped calling her phone. She was still crying, but quietly now, like someone grieving not just a marriage, but the life she thought she'd been living. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I didn't know. I should have known, but I didn't. How could I have lived with him for 8 years and not seen what he was?" I looked at her, really looked at her for the first time since I'd returned, and saw something I hadn't expected to see: relief underneath the grief. She was relieved that I was alive, relieved that the nightmares she'd been having about my death could finally end, relieved that she could stop building her life around a lie. "You couldn't have known," I said, "because he was good at hiding it. That's what made him dangerous." She looked around the gallery at her paintings, her life's work built on blood money. "What do I do now? What do I do with all of this?" "You start over," I said, "just like I did. You decide who you want to be now that you know the truth." The next morning I sat in a coffee shop in Greenwich Village reading the headlines: "Manhattan socialite survives husband's murder, plot returns from dead to seek justice." The photos weren't flattering. They showed me mid-sentence at the gallery, looking tired and older than my 30 years, but they were real, and that was enough. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Maya, it's your mother. Would you like to have coffee? I have 8 years of questions." I typed back, "Yes, but I get to pick the place." Because this time I was in control of my own story, and I wasn't letting anyone else write my ending ever again. 3 months later, I was living in a small apartment on the Upper West Side, not far from where Victoria had moved after selling the gallery and donating most of the proceeds to a foundation for missing persons. She kept one painting, a small abstract piece titled Resurrection, that now hung in her living room. I'd started working as a private investigator specializing in insurance fraud and missing persons cases. My years of hiding and investigating had given me skills that turned out to be quite valuable. Victoria and I had coffee every Sunday, slowly, carefully rebuilding a relationship that had been shattered by lies and violence. It wasn't the same as before. Richard had stolen 8 years from us, and you can't get that time back, but we were building something new, something honest, something that couldn't be destroyed by greed or manipulation. Sometimes I thought about Klaus Brenner rotting in a German prison and Richard Pemberton counting down 25 years in an American one. Sometimes I thought about all the other victims, people who hadn't been lucky enough to survive their murder attempts, people whose killers had never been caught. But mostly I thought about survival, not just staying alive, but staying yourself when the world tries to erase you. I'd learned that death isn't always final. Sometimes it's just a transition, a chance to become someone stronger, someone smarter, someone who can't be eliminated as easily. The Maya Blackwood who'd driven off that cliff in Switzerland had been naive, trusting, vulnerable. The Maya Blackwood who'd walked into that gallery had been forged in 8 years of hiding and investigation. She was someone Richard Pemberton should have been afraid of. And late at night, when I was working on a new case, helping another family find their missing daughter, or exposing another insurance scam, I thought about that moment when Richard's face went white, when he realized that death hadn't silenced me, it had only made me more dangerous. They tried to bury me, but they forgot something important. Some people are too stubborn to stay dead, and some stories are too powerful to be silenced forever. Mine was one of them, and now I was using everything I'd learned to make sure other people's stories didn't end the way mine was supposed to. Because the dead don't stay buried when they're not actually dead, and sometimes coming back from the dead is just the beginning of the real story.